The number is almost impossible to believe when you first hear it, 140 pounds. That is what British soldiers carried across the Falkland Islands during the legendary yomp from San Carlos to Port Stanley. 140 pounds of weapons, ammunition, food, water, shelter, and equipment strapped to human bodies and moved across 56 miles of some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. To put this in perspective, the average British soldier in the Falklands was carrying more than most professional bodybuilders can squat. They were not carrying this weight to a gym and back. They were carrying it across mountains and bogs and frozen ground in combat conditions for 3 consecutive days. And here is what makes this truly remarkable. This was not exceptional. This was doctrine. British soldiers are trained to carry loads that would cripple most infantry forces on Earth. The question is why? Why has the British military developed a culture where crushing weight is considered normal? Why do British load standards exceed almost every other army in the world? And what does this approach produce in soldiers that lighter approaches do not? By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why British soldiers carry more weight than almost any army, how this capability is developed, and what it reveals about a fundamentally different philosophy of infantry warfare. Let me start with the numbers because the comparison is stark. The standard British infantry Bergen, what Americans call a rucksack, is designed to carry loads exceeding 35 kilograms, approximately 77 pounds, as a baseline for extended operations. This is before adding weapon, ammunition, body armor, helmet, water, and mission-specific equipment. When you add these elements, the total combat load for British infantry routinely exceeds 50 kilograms, approximately 110 pounds. Compare this to American load standards. The U.S. Army's recommended fighting load is approximately 30 kilograms, 66 pounds. The approach, march load, what soldiers carry when moving to an objective, is recommended at 45 kilograms, approximately 100 pounds, but these are recommended maximums that training often does not approach. American soldiers may never carry loads near these levels during routine training. British soldiers carry these loads routinely, not occasionally, not only during selection or special exercises, routinely. Regular training marches include loads that American doctrine considers extreme. What Americans call approach march load is what British soldiers call Tuesday. The gap becomes even more dramatic when you examine elite forces. Royal Marines complete their culminating 30-miler across Dartmoor carrying loads that, with weapon and equipment, approach 40 kilograms. Parachute regiment selection includes loaded marches at pace that would be considered impossible by forces that have not trained specifically for such performance. British Special Air Service selection includes the notorious long drag, a march of approximately 64 kilometers carrying 55 pounds of Bergen weight plus equipment. The total load approaches 70 pounds carried over distance that most soldiers could not walk unburdened. These are not arbitrary standards. They reflect a deliberate philosophy about what infantry must be capable of doing. Understanding this philosophy requires understanding British military history and the strategic circumstances that shaped British doctrine. The British Army has always been an expeditionary force. Unlike continental powers that could march to war across land borders, Britain required forces that could project across oceans. This created a fundamental constraint. Logistics by sea are reliable until you leave the ship. Once infantry lands on a hostile shore, resupply becomes uncertain. Forces that depend on immediate logistical support are forces that cannot operate when that support is disrupted. This reality shaped doctrine from the earliest days of the modern British Army. Soldiers had to carry what they needed because they could not assume resupply would be available. The weight on their backs was the difference between capability and helplessness. Light loads meant limited ammunition, limited water, limited shelter. Heavy loads meant soldiers who could sustain operations regardless of whether logistics arrived. Colonial campaigns reinforced this lesson across every imaginable environment. Soldiers carrying equipment through Indian hill country. Forces sustaining operations in African terrain without established supply lines. Campaigns in Afghanistan's Hindu Kush, where every bullet and every biscuit arrived on soldier backs. The common thread was self-sufficiency. British soldiers learned to carry what they needed because history repeatedly proved that carrying less meant running out, when running out meant death. The Falklands War demonstrated this lesson for the modern era. When British forces landed at San Carlos, they faced a 60-mile movement to the objective across terrain, with no road network. Helicopters that should have moved equipment and soldiers were lost when Atlantic conveyor was sunk by Argentine missiles. The campaign that planners assumed would include air mobility became a foot campaign by necessity. If you are finding this analysis valuable and want to understand the real differences between military approaches, subscribe right now. Next week, I am covering the most extreme selection processes in global special operations and what makes soldiers capable of meeting standards others consider impossible. But right now, let me tell you what happened during that Falklands yomp, because it illustrates exactly why heavy load capacity matters. The British forces that marched from San Carlos to Port Stanley included 3 Commando Brigade and elements of 5 Airborne Brigade. They moved across terrain that included the Sussex Mountains, the Wickham Heights, and the infamous Two Sisters Ridge. Weather conditions included snow, freezing rain, and wind that stripped heat from exposed bodies faster than metabolism could replace it. The ground was alternately frozen, solid, and boggy soft, neither condition favorable for movement under load. Soldiers carried not only personal equipment but also shared loads. Mortar rounds distributed among the infantry. Milan missiles carried by troops who would not fire them. Ammunition in quantities that seemed excessive until the Battle of Goose Green consumed it faster than expected. Every pound on soldier backs was a pound that would be available when needed. Every pound left behind was a pound that would not exist when the fighting started. The yomp took 3 days. Soldiers who began the march, tired, finished it, exhausted. But they finished it, and they finished it with ammunition to fight, shelter to survive, and equipment to accomplish their mission. The capability to carry crushing weight translated directly to battlefield success. Forces that could not have carried these loads could not have conducted this campaign. This historical experience is not forgotten in British military culture. It is remembered precisely because it validates the emphasis on load-bearing capability. When British instructors push soldiers to carry loads that seem excessive, the Falklands provides the answer to why. The weight is not arbitrary hardship. The weight is preparation for the day when no helicopter comes and the only path to the objective is your own 2 feet. Let me explain how British training develops this capability, because the methodology is as important as the philosophy. Load-bearing capacity is not general fitness. You can be extraordinarily fit by conventional measures and still collapse under a heavy pack. Cardiovascular endurance helps, but does not determine load capacity. Muscular strength helps, but does not determine load capacity. What determines load capacity is specific adaptation of the musculoskeletal system to the demands of loaded movement. This adaptation requires progressive overload specifically targeting load-bearing. British training introduces loaded marches from the earliest weeks. Royal Marine recruit training includes progression from light loads over short distances to heavy loads over long distances across the 32-week pipeline. The progression is systematic. Week 1 does not resemble week 30. The body adapts incrementally to demands that increase incrementally. The adaptations are specific. Muscles that stabilize the torso under load become stronger. Connective tissue in shoulders, hips, and ankles develops tolerance for sustained pressure. Foot structure adapts to prolonged weight bearing. Neurological patterns optimize movement efficiency under load. These adaptations cannot be developed quickly. They require months of progressive exposure. Rushing the progression produces injury rather than adaptation. American training includes loaded marches, but typically with less volume, less weight, and less progression than British equivalents. The 12-mile ruck for expert infantryman badge requires 35 pounds completed in 3 hours. This is a single event demonstrating minimum competency. British training includes dozens of loaded marches at increasing demands, building maximum capacity rather than verifying minimum competency. The difference in approach produces the difference in capability. British soldiers carry more because their training has prepared them to carry more. The preparation takes time that shorter training pipelines do not provide. The 32 weeks of Royal Marine training exists partly because load-bearing adaptation requires time. Compressing training would compress adaptation and produce soldiers with less load capacity. The equipment philosophy reinforces the training philosophy. British load-bearing equipment is designed for heavy loads carried over extended distances. The Bergen is a simple, robust design optimized for weight distribution during long marches rather than modular convenience during vehicle-based operations. The frame carries weight efficiently to hips and shoulders. The design sacrifices features that would add weight without adding load capacity. American equipment optimizes for different priorities. Modular systems allow reconfiguration for varied mission requirements. Integration with vehicle operations receives significant attention. The equipment is excellent for forces that operate with robust logistics and vehicle support. It is less optimal for forces that must carry everything on their backs for days at a time. This equipment difference reflects strategic difference. American forces expect vehicle support and logistics delivery. British forces prepare for scenarios where such support may not exist. The equipment serves the doctrine. The doctrine reflects history. The history shapes expectation about what soldiers must be capable of doing. Let me address the physiological reality of heavy load carriage, because understanding what soldiers experience illuminates why this capability is not universal. A soldier carrying 100 pounds is experiencing demands that approach the limits of human biomechanics. The spine is compressed under load that it was not evolutionarily designed to bear for extended periods. The hip joints absorb impact forces multiplied by the additional mass. The feet sustain pressure that would cause injury in untrained individuals. Every step is harder than the corresponding unburdened step by a factor proportional to the load. The metabolic cost is equally severe. Carrying 50% of body weight approximately doubles the caloric cost of walking. A soldier who might burn 400 calories per hour walking unburdened burns 800 or more carrying 100 pounds. Over an 8-hour march, this becomes a deficit that food carried cannot fully replace. Soldiers finish heavy marches in caloric debt that takes days to fully recover. The psychological dimension is equally demanding. Heavy load carriage hurts. The pain is constant. Shoulders ache from strap pressure. Hips burn from weight bearing. Feet develop hot spots that become blisters. The mental effort required to continue, despite continuous discomfort, is significant. Soldiers who have not been conditioned to manage this discomfort may find the psychological burden more limiting than the physical burden. British training deliberately develops tolerance for all three dimensions. Physical conditioning develops the structural adaptations required. Metabolic training develops the fuel efficiency and recovery capacity required. Psychological conditioning develops the pain tolerance and mental endurance required. All three dimensions must be addressed because all three determine performance. American training addresses these dimensions, but often to lesser degrees. Physical conditioning for load bearing is typically less extensive. Metabolic training for extended effort may be less emphasized. Psychological conditioning for sustained discomfort receives attention in selection programs but may be less systematically developed across conventional forces. The result is the capability gap observed in joint exercises. British soldiers carry loads that American soldiers find unsustainable. The gap is not in character or motivation. The gap is in preparation. British soldiers can carry more because their training has prepared them to carry more across all three dimensions that determine load capacity. Let me tell you about what this capability produces operationally because the training investment must produce operational value to be worthwhile. British infantry in Afghanistan demonstrated heavy load capability in operational context. Soldiers in Helmand Province conducted patrols carrying combat loads that routinely exceeded 100 pounds. The terrain was harsh. The climate was extreme. The enemy waited for any opportunity to engage forces that were vulnerable. The weight included not only personal fighting equipment but also shared loads essential to patrol capability, radios and batteries for communication, medical supplies beyond individual first aid, ammunition in quantities sufficient for sustained engagements, water that could not be resupplied from hostile territory. Every pound was carried because every pound served a purpose that could not be sacrificed. Patrols extended for hours across ground that vehicles could not traverse. Soldiers maintained tactical effectiveness while managing loads that would exhaust untrained individuals within the first mile. The training investment paid returns in operational flexibility. Forces that could carry what they needed could go where they needed. Forces limited by load capacity were limited in operational reach. American forces in the same theater faced similar challenges but sometimes responded differently. Lighter loads enabled faster movement but required more frequent resupply. Vehicle dependency provided logistics, reliability, but limited terrain access. The trade-offs were real and reflected doctrinal choices. Neither approach was universally superior. But when the mission required extended operations without resupply and terrain, vehicles could not reach. Forces with greater load capacity had advantage. The contrast is not about which force is better. Both American and British forces in Afghanistan demonstrated extraordinary capability and courage. The contrast is about different optimizations producing different capabilities. British forces optimized for self-sufficient foot mobility at heavy loads. American forces optimized for combined arms integration with vehicle support. Both optimizations are rational. They produce different forces suited for different operational requirements. The future of ground warfare may favor heavy load capability more than recent assumptions suggested. Peer adversaries can contest air superiority that enables logistics delivery. Drone surveillance makes vehicle movement increasingly dangerous. Electronic warfare can disrupt the communications that coordinate resupply. In a contested environment against capable adversaries, forces that can operate without the logistics umbilical may have decisive advantage. British doctrine has never assumed air superiority would be permanent. British logistics planning has never assumed resupply would be uninterrupted. The emphasis on soldier load capacity reflects healthy skepticism about assumptions that may fail precisely when they matter most. Train for the worst case if better cases materialize. The capability is still available. If worse cases materialize, the capability exists when needed. Let me share perspectives from soldiers who have experienced British load standards because individual accounts illuminate what statistics cannot capture. A Royal Marine corporal who completed the 30-miler described what the training produces. He said the march is not really about the march. It is about what the march proves. When you complete it, you know you can carry anything, anywhere. The weight becomes irrelevant because you have carried heavier over worse terrain for longer. Nothing operational will ever be harder than what training made you do. He continued by explaining how the capability feels different from fitness. He said you can be fit without being able to carry weight. Running fast does not prepare you for heavy loads. Lifting heavy does not prepare you for long marches. The specific capability for loaded movement is specific. You develop it through loaded movement. There is no shortcut. A parachute regiment sergeant who had conducted joint training with American forces offered comparative perspective. He said American soldiers are very fit. Their running times are excellent. Their strength is impressive. But heavy loads are a different thing. When we conducted combined marches, they struggled at weights we considered light. Not because they were weak, because their training had not prepared them for this specific challenge. He noted that this was not criticism of American soldiers as individuals. He said they would develop the same capability if their training included the same preparation. The difference is training, not talent. Any soldier could become capable of British loads if given British training. The question is whether their military invests in that development. A British Army officer who served in a NATO training role offered strategic perspective. She observed that alliance operations assume interoperability that may not exist for load-bearing. NATO planning documents describe combined operations where forces from different nations operate together. These plans sometimes assume infantry forces share comparable movement rates under load. The assumption is not accurate. British forces can move at paces carrying loads that Allied forces cannot match. This creates planning challenges. Her recommendation was that NATO either accept differential capability and plan around it, or invest in developing common standards that all forces can achieve. The current approach, assuming interoperability that does not exist, creates risk that may not be visible until operational circumstances expose it. The question of whether other armies should adopt British load standards has no universal answer. The British approach reflects British strategic circumstances and British force structure. Small professional forces that may operate far from support must be sufficient. Heavy load capacity serves this requirement. Larger forces with robust logistics may optimize differently. There is no single correct answer for all circumstances. What can be said is that heavy load capacity provides options that lighter approaches do not. Forces that can carry more can sustain operations longer without resupply. Forces that can march further under load can reach objectives that lighter forces cannot access. Forces that train for extreme loads find operational loads less demanding. The capability creates flexibility that may prove valuable in circumstances that cannot be fully predicted. The developmental cost is time. British training pipelines are longer than many Allied equivalents, partly because load adaptation requires time. Organizations seeking faster production of soldiers may not invest the time required for full load capacity development. This trade-off is legitimate. Different requirements justify different training investments, but the trade-off is real. Shorter training produces soldiers with less load capacity than longer training would produce. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Next week, I am covering why different NATO Special Operations Forces maintain dramatically different physical selection standards and what makes certain standards achievable that others consider impossible. The week after that, I am examining a joint exercise where load capacity differences created operational challenges that planners had not anticipated. Drop your comments below. Tell me about your own experiences with heavy load training if you have served. Tell me whether you believe heavy load capacity is essential for modern infantry or whether technology has reduced its importance. These perspectives matter because the debate about load standards continues in every military. That must decide how to prepare soldiers for future requirements. If you learned something from this video, share it with someone who appreciates understanding why different militaries develop different capabilities. Not the simplified version where everyone is the same, but the reality where training choices shape force characteristics in ways that produce genuine differences. The British soldier carries more than almost any army because British training produces that capability and British doctrine requires it. The training investment is substantial. The time requirement is significant. The physical demands on soldiers are severe, but the product is infantry that can sustain operations in circumstances where lighter forces would become logistics dependent or operationally limited. This capability is not inherent to British soldiers as individuals. It is developed through training that any military could implement if willing to invest the time and resources. The British have made this investment because their strategic circumstances historically demanded it. Forces that might fight far from home without reliable resupply needed soldiers who carried what they needed. This history shapes current doctrine. Current doctrine produces current capability. The weight on a British soldier's back is not punishment, it is preparation. Preparation for the day when helicopters are not available. Preparation for terrain that vehicles cannot traverse. Preparation for operations that extend beyond what lighter loads would sustain. The preparation is uncomfortable. The preparation is demanding. The preparation produces soldiers who can do what soldiers trained without it cannot do. Until next time, remember that capability is built through training that demands capability. British soldiers carry more than almost any army because British training demands it. The demanding training produces the demanding capability. There is no mystery in this equation. There is only investment and outcome. Heavy training, investment, and load capacity produces heavy load capacity. Lighter investment produces lighter capacity. Each military makes choices about investment. The choices produce the forces. The forces define what operations are possible. The weight matters. The weight has always mattered. The weight will continue to matter for as long as infantry must move to where enemies are and carry what they need to fight when they arrive. British military culture understands this. British training reflects this understanding. British soldiers carry the result of this understanding on their backs across every terrain where British forces operate. 140 pounds across 56 miles. That is what the Falklands demanded. That is what British soldiers delivered. That capability did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from training that prepared soldiers for exactly that demand. The training came first. The capability followed. This sequence cannot be reversed. You cannot demand capability that training has not produced. You can only produce capability through training that creates it. British training creates heavy load capacity. That is why British soldiers carry more than almost any army. The answer is not mysterious. The answer is training. The training is demanding because the capability is demanding. The capability exists because the training exists. This is how military forces are built. This is why British soldiers can do what others cannot. The weight on their backs proves what their training has made them.